Good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Elise Wirkus. I'm Issue One's Legislative Director, and we are thrilled to be hosting this event today with our friends at the Project On Government Oversight and National Taxpayers Union on the critical bipartisan issue of banning members of Congress from trading stocks while in office. We are thrilled to be joined by Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger and Congressman Chip Roy today on this issue, who have been leading on this issue for months in the House. And also we are joined by former Congressman Zach Wamp and former Congressman Brian Baird of Issue One's Reformers Caucus. And for those who don't know, Issue One's Reformers Caucus is a group of nearly 200 former members of Congress, cabinet officials, and governors from all 50 states and all political perspectives who have come together to talk about political reform and to talk about fixing our political system. Today's panel will be moderated by Warren Rojas of Business Insider. And just to note before we get started, if you are a member of the media or a member of the public and would like to submit a question to our panelists, please do so in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. Thank you for joining us, and I will hand it over to Warren.
Thank you so much, Elise. Warren Rojas here, a correspondent with Insider, who's delved into this issue a little bit, but obviously so much more to talk about, and is excited to dig in with these officials who have worked on various aspects of it. Congresswoman Spanberger and Congressman Roy, obviously at the forefront of this issue now. Former Congressman Wamp and Baird had a hand in things leading up to this, so I'd love to just dive right in and ask. Right now, Congress is very much involved in talking about this. It's showing up in political ads. Opponents are dinging both sides, saying, oh, this is going to be an election issue. And meanwhile, inside both chambers, party leaders are trying to figure out what can be done in the short span of time between now and November, or if this carries over further. So I'd just love to ask Congresswoman Spanberger and Congressman Roy, how has the Trust Act in Congress, the Trust in Congress Act and attitudes on Capitol Hill about stock trading changed since you first brought this legislation up in 2020?
So since we first started really pushing on this piece of legislation, it's been a slow but steady drumbeat. Certainly in the early days when we introduced it last Congress, there were a number of members who said, I want to be compliant before I get on the legislation. When we reintroduced it in 2021, you'll see that our co-sponsor list began to grow pretty significantly and steadily. And certainly in recent months, just the topic of stock trading by members of Congress, members of the Senate, has become a central issue that reporters like yourself, Warren, have been covering. And as we've seen sort of ongoing reports since 2020, since the early days of the pandemic, and ever since, there's been a lot of coverage of the types of stock ownership that members of Congress have, the sales that they have completed, the purchases that they've completed, because of course, thanks to my colleagues who are joining us today, we have significant transparency in terms of what we do with our financial holdings. But I believe we need to go a step beyond that, which is why Congressman Roy and I have partnered to put this legislation forward. So day by day, we get more co-sponsors. We're more than 50, bipartisan. It's the most bipartisan bill out there related to stock trading by members of Congress. And I'm proud of the work. We're going to keep pushing it, because it matters to people. It matters to the people across my district. It makes sense. And I think at a time when people are, still very distrusting, very divided, the idea that we as members of Congress would take an affirmative step to say we are deserving of your trust and we are focused on you, not our stock portfolios, is an important step that not only do we think we should take, but the public very clearly does as well.
Yeah, I can't add too much to what Abigail just said in terms of the current posture and where things currently stand. The only thing that I'll add that I think is critically important is people, particularly critics that say, well, what can you do? This is complicated blind trust, or, this isn't necessary. I think that my favorite argument is the one that says, well, this isn't necessary. We have transparency. Of course, a lot of those people fought the transparency bills, 6 or 7 years ago, but whatever. So we have transparency, so don't worry about it. Well, the problem with that from my standpoint is like, yeah, transparency is good. But at the end of the day, right now, you have members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, who are actively engaging in the purchase and selling of securities on really holding an interest in companies that they're making very big decisions on policy matters on those companies. So, for example, last summer in the House Judiciary Committee, on which I served, we were debating on both sides of the aisle. It was a pretty bipartisan conversation about antitrust issues involving, large tech companies and Google and Facebook and companies across the spectrum. We've obviously had a whole lot of debates over the last 2 years about healthcare policy and about what we're doing with vaccines. And we're not going to go down that road of conversation, but people have made a lot of money on Pfizer. People have made a lot of money on insurance companies over these years, and over half of the revenue of every major insurance company comes from government contracts. Let's not talk about the defense industrial complex, right? All of these things are very legitimate and real. It is a real concern, and we'll probably talk about this more later. I don't want to filibuster here about how you manage that when someone comes into Congress and they hold securities. Like, what do? I'll get into my own. I'll walk you through my own situation with that in my modest holdings. It was complex for reasons I can explain later, but I think we ought to have a debate. Abigail and I introduced this 2 years ago, right? This isn't something new. It's something that we think we ought to be having a debate about. It doesn't mean it's an our way or the highway. This is the bill. You must pass this bill. But it does mean we've been thinking about it a long time. We think we ought to start with our bill. And then if people have an amendment or two to tweak it, let's have that debate. It'd be great.
Well, along the lines of tweaking it, so there are other proposals out there, both in the House and Senate, and the breadth of the coverage and even the enforcement mechanism. Some people are saying, it has to be all members of Congress, it has to be senior staff, committee staff, spouses, dependent children, extended to other branches of government, and then however hard you want to go on all the profits from any trades, a chunk of your salary. Is there? Where do you see the commonality coming together in terms of is there a danger that you aim too high and then nothing happens, or can you get to a consensus sooner rather than later on what's mission critical here?
Go ahead, Abigail.
Well, I think Chip and I have a very strong line in the sand, which is spouses must be included and dependent children must be included. To put forth a stock ban that only applies to members would be, as I would perceive it as an American, as a voter, as a constituent, kind of a slap in the face of the American people. Like, we're assuming that they're not going to realize that, I have conversations with my spouse, or if my dependent children have stock holdings, that, I'm not in control of that. So that is a line in the sand. And there are some proposals out there that do not include spouses or dependent children. I think that's a hard line that is important, necessary, and without it, the legislation is kind of a little bit more hand-wavy. I think that we need to get our own house in order first and foremost, and that's members of Congress, our spouses, and our dependent children. We are the ones who are elected. We are the ones that the people cannot just summarily fire. If there's unethical behavior, if there's challenges on our staffs, those people can be let go. That is very different when it's the member of Congress. We are also the ones with the votes, not our staff. We're also the ones in all of the briefings, not our staff members. And I do think that we should look towards taking steps to include high-ranking staff, include the judiciary, include kind of a broader sense to affirmatively ensure people trust the United States government in all of its pieces. But the cynical view would be that efforts to include everybody all at once is an effort to include a poison pill that makes a bill unwieldy and impossible to move forward. And so that's why I continue to advocate for let's police ourselves first. Let's hold ourselves to the highest standard first, and then we take the next look at who comes next.
Yeah, Abigail covered it pretty well, and we have a lot of agreement on this. Let me just add one thing on the spousal issue, which Abigail and I put in the bill, which is to allow for, of course, things like stock options if your spouse is working for a company and they're getting those options. Allow for mechanisms of the normal course of order that you don't want to completely prohibit, recognizing that you've got two spouses with independent careers and how that all works. And I think, and we try to account for that, and maybe we can tweak it to account for it better. Happy to have that debate. but it's not, it wouldn't make sense. It would defy logic to say that you're not going to include your immediate family. Because, you know, I think everybody would see that for what it is. But I also, you know, look, on staff, I'm a former staffer. I happen to believe that, look, we can fire staff. I mean, they're separate, right? And they're not the ones taking the oath with an election certificate that is given the public trust of representing constituents. I understand that there are questions about what they know, but we already have insider trading bans. We already have transparency on staff. But the problem you've got with members, in my opinion, is that it just looks to the American people like you've got 535 members of Congress in the Senate who are there for their own interest. Yeah. I don't hear anybody back home going, man, those staffers, they're just killing our country, right? I mean, we have to go back and respond to our constituents. So I would prefer to focus on us. I think Abigail put it very well, and to try to move that across the finish line with a product that we can all be proud of and support, but that also works. And I do think there are things that we can continue to debate about it. And Abigail and I've talked. We've had a number of conversations back and forth about what we think, and I think we're very much aligned. But even there might be a couple of little differences here about what we would think about an amendment. That's okay. That we're supposed to be able to offer amendments and have a debate. And that's the last point I'll make on this is what I hope will happen is it is not happening in Congress right now. We haven't had an amendment offered on the floor of the House in open debate since May of 2016. That's 6 years. It's all cooked up behind closed doors by the leadership of both parties. And then it's put down in a rule and everybody has to vote on it. And that doesn't work. You drop a bill on the floor and say, take it or leave it. Let a member go, hey, I think we ought to include staff. We debate it for 6 hours, have actual members on the floor, and then have a vote on it, up or down. And if the product moves in a direction that I don't like, maybe I won't support it in the end. And then I'll have to answer to my constituents. If it moves better, great. We all come together and it passes 420 to 15. But we should debate, amend, vote.
Very good. So may I ask Congressman Wamp and Baird, the focus here on keeping the accountability on the members and having this legislative process be as transparent, as productive as possible. What do you did the Stock Act, the original one, accomplish what it was set out to do, or were there things that you would have liked to have seen changed before it became law?
Brian, go.
Well, shall I jump in, Zach?
Yes.
First of all, I want to thank Representatives Spanberger and Roy for your leadership on this. It's really essential. You know, the fundamental principle you both said, it's we should be elected to serve the public, not to serve ourselves. And we shouldn't let our votes influence our portfolio or our portfolio influence our votes. You know, Zach and I were in the room when the Secretary of Treasury and the head of the Federal Reserve came in the Great Recession, and we had a closed session. Economy's in serious trouble. Well, at that point, our thought should be, what are we going to do to help the American people? Not, I better call my broker. And what you've done, you know, the Stock Act really improved transparency. Prior to that, we only had to report our trades in May of the following year of the trade. So after the election was over, long since events would have passed that were hard to trade, would have been hard to trace. But we changed that. We initially proposed a 48-hour rule, which is what CEOs have to do. In other words, report in 48 hours. That got weakened to 45, but still 45 is pretty good. The challenge, though, are twofold. One, a lot of members aren't reporting as they're supposed to under stock. And the other thing is, even if we ban insider trading, which Stock Act did, there's still conflicts of interest in two ways. One, members can hold stocks, as Representative Roy and Spanberger were saying, that they have an interest in, and you're going to vote on that to protect your stock. I could get in and out of the market as a whole. You know, my personal preference would be require broad-based index funds, and then say you can't trade from the time you get into Congress until the time you leave, because otherwise people can time the market. If you invest broadly in the markets, you've got a pretty good investment. So that's what I think Representatives Spanberger and Roy are about. I'm all for it.
Let me add a couple things. Brian's breaking up a little bit there. First, I think when Spanberger and Roy come together, the country pays attention, because it is still possible for us to work together in a bipartisan way. And this proves it. And there's a lot of momentum. Secondly, most members are decent, honorable people. There are a few that are there for themselves. That's honestly the truth, and that's unfortunate, but most members are decent, honorable people. And before COVID, over 100 members of the House were sleeping in their offices. And the reason is that if you got kids in college at the current pay, which is basically flat, you don't have a housing allowance, you can be under stress. I left Congress with a big second mortgage because I sent 2 kids to college. So there are real issues. But the problem with addressing the real issues is the solution is not to let them day trade to try to profit from information or their service. Public service is public service. When I left after 16 years, my brother said, I'm not impressed with all the things you did as much as the fact that you never traded stocks or gained financially while you were there. You were there to serve the public. So let's try to put ethics above party or anything. Somebody asked on a question, I just saw it, why is this all of a sudden got momentum? Well, I think COVID sort of woke us all up to some things that are bigger than we are. And when we went into COVID and people panicked, like Chip said, people look to, well, oh, what can I do? And we need to have a system where everybody knows a bright line of what's right, what's wrong, what's ethical, so the country can reclaim confidence in its leaders. That's what issue 1 is all about. And these 2 leaders should be commended. And all the nuances, just get something done that clearly shows we can put ethics above partisan interests or personal interests.
Thank you, sir. In terms of getting that thing done, Congresswoman Spanberger and Congressman Roy, one of the attendees wants to know, what does the ideal enforcement mechanism look like? Right now, there's a $200 fine that sometimes gets assessed, sometimes doesn't. So what would you like to see done that not only deters the stock trading, but also has a proportional penalty to, making millions of dollars and just paying $200 up front?
Chip, do you want to begin on this one?
Yeah, go ahead. I filibustered on the answer one. Go ahead.
Well, so with our bill, it is focused on just a pretty hard line, which is if you're in Congress, you, your spouse, your dependent children cannot buy or sell individual stocks. You can have mutual funds, you can be invested towards your retirement, but you can't be trading anything. So where we currently see that with transparency that exists, there's fines along the way if you don't file your disclosures, if you're with outside the grace period. With us, it's a pretty hard line. Among the things that Chip and I have discussed, certainly there's some iterations of bills that have financial penalties if you don't put your money into a blind trust, if you don't follow this legislation. Chip and I have also discussed kind of broader, how can you impact someone's experience in Congress? Ethics violations, does it make you ineligible for leadership? The sorts of things that, frankly, if you are looking at someone who has significant stock holdings, then that cost benefit analysis, again, if they're thinking about their pocketbook, may not always align them with being compliant with what we're seeking to make the law. But certainly impacting people and their ability to serve the way they want to serve or continue in Congress the way they wish to continue in Congress are kind of all discussions that are on the table at this point in time.
Yeah, look, I think that, let me give you a couple of quick examples. So when I came into Congress 3 years ago, I came in with most of my stuff in index funds, and I wish I had more stuff to be worried about. But most of my stuff in index funds, and then a handful of equities. Now, when I say handful, I think 3 or 4 in my name and a couple in my wife's name. Now, as a technical matter, full disclosure, and Abigail knows this, they're still sitting there. I have purchased no new equity since I've been in office. But the reason was because I held a couple of securities, one of which was Kinder Morgan, which is a pipeline stock. And they were running a pipeline through the district I represent, Texas 21. And it was pretty controversial. It had some environmental issues. They're running a pipe under the river. And I won't get into the details there, but I was aggravated with them. So I started taking some positions publicly questioning what they were doing. And so then I went to ethics and I said, well, if I sell now, am I looking like I'm selling into hitting them? right? So in other words, I'm beating them up publicly, and then I'm selling the stock. Is it going to look like I'm gaming the system? So I just kind of, what I just said to my wife, I said, well, let's just freeze. Let's make sure we're not going to buy anything. I'm not going to sell any of these. And that's the position I've been sitting on, dating back to when Abigail and I introduced the bill. Again, we're not talking about a large number, but I raised that issue as an example as to why it gets complex. If you're trying to do the right thing, and you know, I'll let other people judge that, it gets complex if you've got an interest in these things. But I am open to, in that situation, right? I've had colleagues who have come to me and said, well, I mean, you know, they're not a multimillionaire and they've got, you know, a few $100,000 in investments, and maybe they inherited something, or, you know, maybe they earned a little bit from all their work in a company for 20 years, or their spouse did. What can you do about that? Blind trusts are not cheap and easy. Okay. Recognize, you got to figure that out. Can we set those up to work easier? Can we set up a different tool that would make it blind, but it's not that complex? And then index funds means, well, are you forcing a member to divest from something that was valuable to him or her for the hard work they did, leading them to be, you know, elected to Congress? I'm open to ways in which that can be preserved in a blind trust, or exceptions for certain things. But I think that at the core of it, and what I don't want to get lost in all of that, because I think all of that can be solved for Congress. We can solve the problem. I don't want lost in that is just the simple idea. Should I be able to go tomorrow and go buy puts and calls or a big position in, you know, Pfizer while we're having these fights right now, or in Google or Facebook while we're having antitrust fights, to use the examples before? I don't think that's healthy. So let's figure this out. There's a way to do it that doesn't discourage individuals who've had successful careers to be able to maintain assets, because as was pointed out earlier, it is financially difficult sometimes. You're having to figure out apartments and deal with that and issues, and you're sending your kids to college and all that. Like, my wife and I have these conversations every day. How do we figure this out? But we can figure it out. And I think that's the most important part.
Congressman Roy, I know you've got a full plate this morning and may need to hop off here. Would love, thank you so much for your time. But before you do run, what is your ideal timetable to get this accomplished in terms of, you know, when is a House vote feasible? When do you think it ripens?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm here as long as y'all need me. I've got till probably 9 o'clock my time. And yeah, I got another half an hour, whatever you all need. But timetable, I think, you know, the American people want to see us do the right thing. I don't have a particular rush timetable. I go back to what I said. I would like us to not feel like leadership has to go run around on either side of the aisle and, well, let's go come up with a bill that we can get this done to say we got it done. Let's just bring, I think, Abigail's and my bill to the floor of the House. Let's actually reinstate open amendments and rules. Let's allow members to offer amendments. Let's have a real debate. Let's have a real live discussion on the floor of the House, instead of one of us giving a speech to an empty chamber at 8 o'clock at night in a special order, because that's all we have right now. And I know, I feel like I'm beating a drum on that. You're like, well, how's that on point? Well, because it's on point, because that's actually the issue. We have a good bill that I think could serve as the engine. Now let's just figure out what to do with it, to tweak it. Maybe, like I said, something about the blind trust, whatever. But I'd like to see it come to the floor and have debate and vote on it. Doesn't have to be next week. It could be in a month, 2 months, you know, later this year. But let's go through it, work through the process, take in information, hear concerns, and do something for the good of the country.
And if I can add on to what Chip was saying, I think that his point about really allowing for amendments for debate on this topic is incredibly important. I mean, frankly, it should be important for any piece of legislation we're pursuing, but in this particular case, right, let's say that we were to put our bill on the floor, or let's say that sort of leadership, and you know, in the House, that would mean Democratic leadership comes up with a proposal, they put it on the floor, because there isn't the opportunity for buy-in, and that could be votes for or against amendments. Let's say they put a bill on the floor that doesn't include spouses. Well, then those of us who say, like, it's spouses must be included, we will have never had the opportunity to take a vote. And frankly, if our colleagues overrule us and say, no, you're just being a little bit over the top, spouses don't need to be included, then if we have that vote on an amendment, if we use to use Chip's term, if our bill's the engine, let someone put forth an amendment that would remove spouses from our piece of legislation.
Right.
And if that passes, then that's sort of the will of Congress and the people. If it doesn't, it moves forward, right? And let people be accountable for each step along the way. Because I do think that a bill that is as important in restoring trust, but also is personal to the people that it is mandating this to, members of Congress, members of the Senate, we have a lot of self-interest in what we choose to do or not do. And so all along the way, we should be debating and amending. And Chip and I have both had the conversations with so many of our colleagues. I've had Republicans and Democrats come to me. I know he's had the same, where they say, well, what about this particular circumstance? Or what about this kind of nuanced case? And our approach on this has been, if you have, we thought about this bill for a long time, but we thought about it with the approach, the information that our teams, and the kind of brain trust that we went to on this had. If we've missed something, if there's something to broaden, if there's something to change or tweak or lay out and make clear in the language, bring that forward. And with a bill like this, the ability to vote on amendments on the floor would allow the American people to see where their representatives stand on the larger issue, but also on the pieces that get you there. Because there's a world in which we put forth a bill that's kind of pulled out by Democratic leadership, and there's at least one or two poison pills in there that would make it so that every single Republican potentially, including the co-lead of this legislation, would be able to say, they took it and destroyed it, done. Right. And then it becomes just a partisan bickering match of, one side or the other kind of trying to take up the mantle of being principled when there wasn't actually the intention of getting a bill signed into law. And when we know we are contending with the cloture vote requirement on the Senate side, the ability and the need to build out consensus on legislation, frankly, as impactful as this, is vitally important. Otherwise, it's all performative and it doesn't make a change. And Chip and I were interested in actually making a change and actually getting a bill to the president's desk.
Congressman Baird and Wamp, from the outside looking in, is there, is this train, is there any way to stop it? Or could this kind of fizzle out between now and November and then fall off the radar? Or does this need to happen? Is America paying attention now?
Let me say quickly, and then Brian, you get the closing word, but I would say quickly, our Reformers Caucus is very concerned about an issue that Chip and Abigail have talked about, and that is, at no time in the history of our country has the leadership had more power and the members had less power. The framers never wanted the leadership to make all the decisions about what gets voted on, what doesn't get voted on, what gets amended. It doesn't matter who's in a majority. This is a bad trend. And this is a big issue. And the Stock Act is an example of how this can keep us from doing the right thing. Even if the members want to do the right thing, the leadership should not stand in the way. Regardless of their position, let the American people vote on these issues through their elected representatives. That is a big issue, Brian.
Zach, you're exactly right. And one of the things you said earlier, most members of Congress are good, decent people there to serve the public. And one of the problems with the situation that we're in is they run the risk that a few bad actors spoil it for everybody. There were members of Congress when you and I were in office, Zach, who were day trading from their office and made dozens of trades from their congressional office. But it's a small minority of folks who do that. And so this bill that Representatives Spanberger and Roy are doing will actually make members of Congress' lives easier in a couple ways. They won't have to constantly defend themselves against something they never did or never wanted to do. The institution will be held in higher esteem. Frankly, they won't have to worry about their portfolio. Just make it into a broad-based fund. You'll do just fine over the long haul. And Congress will improve its position in the eyes of the public. And right now, we desperately need that. So I'm with you, with all three of you. This needs to pass. It needs to pass with vigorous but open public debate. And then we need to enact it and get on with it so the public can say, look, by God, Democrats and Republicans can work together for the good of the country and put their self-interest aside. And that's a good message. It's good policy.
Well, thank you all for this open and vigorous debate. Congressman Baird, Congressman Wamp, and Congresswoman Spanberger, very much appreciate your insights and looking forward to keeping tabs on this issue as it moves forward.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to the Congress members for introducing this.
Thank you for leading by example, Brian and Zach.
And we'd like to continue now to bring up the second panelists, our second group of panelists, which includes my colleague Camila DeChalus from Insider, Dylan Hedtler-Gaudette from Project on Government Oversight, and Andrew Lautz from the National Taxpayers Union.
Hi, Warren. Thanks so much for having us on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Well, good morning. Well, you heard what the members of Congress had to say about what's going on the Hill right now and what led up to it as, you know, part of the world that has to deal with all this information, the gathering, the dissecting, the parsing all these financial documents. What do you think the general public and government watchdogs can do to ensure that this issue doesn't fade away in the next month after the election? You know, how do we keep the heat on to see what happens here?
Well, I'm happy to take a first crack at that. What I would say to the general public and to the folks tuning into this webinar right now is you have the power to keep the pressure on by making sure your members of Congress know that this is an issue that you care about and that means a lot to you. And you can make those calls, you can send those emails, you can tweet those tweets to make that clear. And I can tell you, as a person who works with Congress a lot and works with staff, they are aware of how much the public is interested in this issue and how strongly the public feels about it. We see polls come out recently that indicate anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans, and that cuts across partisan affiliation, are all in the same place on this issue. And we all feel that Congress needs to be banned from trading individual stocks, period. So the public is in the right place on this. And we just need to make sure that the attention and the pressure, we keep the attention and the pressure going.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan. And I'll add, I think if constituents make clear to their members of Congress and if voters make clear to the candidates running for office for House and Senate in this midterm elections, if they make it clear that this issue is going to be part of who they consider in terms of actually voting this November in the midterm elections, I think that's really going to put the pressure up. You see more candidates who are not yet in office weighing in on this issue, candidates for the U.S. Senate, candidates for U.S. House. I think if this becomes a midterm election issue, I think there will be pressure to act in both chambers of Congress before the election happens, because both parties will be looking for political wins ahead of the midterms. And even if it doesn't get done before the midterm elections, I think the more you have this being a midterm election issue, the more candidates and the more current members of Congress who have promising to take action on it, if elected or when elected, the better chance we'll have of actually getting something done in 2023, because then it becomes a campaign promise. So I think as this becomes more of a midterm election issue, and as voters make clear to their members and to their candidates for office that this is going to factor into their vote, that there is a better chance that this gets done sooner rather than later.
And I just want to piggyback really quickly on Angie's point here about just the public interest in this matter, kind of before when we started talking, launching into this project that Insider did about conflicted Congress and started looking into stock tradings that lawmakers and their congressional staffers that were more on the senior level were making. You know, we kind of started seeing this really big trend that this didn't really just start with just one or two lawmakers, that this was kind of widespread also in the House of Representatives and the senators. And I think as more conversations have now sparked about this conversation of whether we should be banning lawmakers from doing individual stock trading, the conversation has expanded to not only include lawmakers, but also judges, whether they should be banned from trading individual stocks, judges who sit on Supreme Court or just federal judges on the bench. And then also now the conversation has also sparked last earlier this week, Senator Elizabeth Warren made a comment saying that state lawmakers in all 50 states should be banned. So I think this conversation about whether US lawmakers should be banned from trading individual stocks has now really expanded to include all elected officials. And that's something really important to know. And this is really how we've gauged the public's interest in this matter.
To your point, Camila, one of the viewers is asking about whether the push to expand this transparency to the Supreme Court, to the judiciary, is there any chance that that either delays or derails this in terms of, Congresswoman Spanberger and Roy both said, let's focus on members first, spouses and the dependent children, and anything else is gravy, but let's do that. So does casting too wide a net, imperil this?
Yes, I mean, I've heard from several senators who weighed in on the debate of whether state lawmakers should be also have this ban applied. And, their disposition, some lawmakers were saying, like Senator Tim Kaine, of a Democrat from Virginia, was saying, let them take that up on their own. Let state legislators debate amongst themselves about this. But as US senators who are in Congress right now, we do have a responsibility to try to pass this bill first. So I do think it's going to be a piecemeal approach of where you see Congress act, and then maybe we will see this continuing trend of other state legislators and other judicial bodies taking up the same type of policies.
I might jump in here. I can't overstate how much I agree with Congresswoman Spanberger and Congressman Roy here about keeping the main thing. Right now, the public, as we alluded to earlier, is very engaged and supportive of the issue of congressional stock trading ban. It is not to say that that's not something worth considering and trying to push for as far as the judiciary and as far as the executive branch. That is also good and necessary policy, but that should be pursuing on a parallel track. I think I'm deeply concerned because Congress has not demonstrated an ability to do much of anything at all recently. And I worry that if we take something like a congressional stock trade ban that has momentum, that has legs, and we try to attach a bunch of other wish list items to it, as good as those wish list items might be, I think we'll end up in a situation where if we try to encompass everyone, we will end up not doing anything. So I would argue that we should keep the main thing here. We should pass a congressional stock trading ban that includes spouses and dependent children, and then we should continue the push on the other branches. And I would also note, as a bit of some news in this front that not everyone may be aware of, just last night, the Senate actually passed a bill that would require more disclosure and transparency in the federal judiciary. It would basically create a stock act for the judiciary, which is a revolutionary move in terms of what the courts currently have to do in terms of financial disclosure. So there is already movement and momentum happening when it comes to the courts. And I think we need to allow these two things to operate on parallel and distinct tracks.
I think a key to just supplement Dylan's point, I think a key tension in good policy making is time versus momentum. There's a lot of momentum on this issue right now, and I worry that trying to create, craft the absolutely perfect and most comprehensive piece of legislation you've ever seen on this issue could actually lead us into other and bigger, quite frankly, bigger policy fights that will distract us from getting something done. There's a Supreme Court fight looming. There's still pending action on President Biden's Build Back Better package. There's the midterm elections. So I worry about the perfect being the enemy of the good here. At the same time, as both Congressman Roy and Congresswoman Spanberger shared in the first panel, we need, you need to take time to make good policy. We don't want to rush and just do sort of clear the lowest bar and do the absolute minimum and check the box and say, well, this issue is done with. So there's a key tension there, and I think there's probably a happy middle somewhere in between taking action tomorrow or next week on this legislation and waiting until after the midterm elections.
Well, as these, I guess all the lawmakers on the panel seem to agree that they feel that their transparency is there, that part of the equation is fine. Obviously, there needs to be work done on the enforcement and kind of the rest of it and the exposure. What recommendations would you, who quite often have to dig into these files and sift through these documents, what would you make right now in terms of improving access to this information and the user friendliness of it, so citizens, journalists, whoever is interested in this type of accountability can hold, can look at the data and use it to say, hey, something's not right here?
It's something I think Camila is very well positioned to speak to with all your work in the conflicted Congress and trying to access particularly the disclosures of staff. Did you want to take that, Camila?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to give you guys some time. I think one of the things I heard time and time again when talking to congressional studies experts and even, former staff members who worked on the original Stock Act is that they would like to see more reforms done into the filings of these financial disclosure forms. And to be more specific, they say they want to see, instead of having, right now, what you have is that, let's say a lawmaker trades a stock, you get the range of how much they bought or sold that stock for. So sometimes it says 10,000 to 15,000. They would prefer to see the exact dollar amount to the T of how much they actually spent or bought or sold or bought that stock transaction. They think that's crucial. Also, another thing that's really important is that the day that the transaction is made, usually that's when they should file it, or they're given a time frame. But you can find that on the time that they sign the document. Usually that's what it's an indicator of. Okay, this is when they acknowledge that the stock transaction happened. Maybe they use a financial advisor. A lot of experts told me that they really want to see the exact time and the day of when that transaction occurred. And that is crucial. There's a lot of conversations centered around, well, did this lawmaker receive information on this day? And then that's when they made the trade. Well, a lot of times you can draw a little bit more of a more concise conclusion on that if you are given more precise information. So those are just two really big reforms that, just talking to people throughout this 5-month long investigation, that I heard constantly over and over again, they want to see an exact time frame of when the transaction occurred, and they want to see the exact dollar amount.
One thing just to follow up on that, I think it's also really important that, to the extent that we still have a kind of a reporting and disclosure framework around financial disclosure documents, I think they need to do some serious reforming and overhauling of the actual ways in which those documents are accessed, because right now trying to get those reports is somewhat hard, and the reports themselves are not in the most accessible formats, so it becomes difficult for a lot of people to actually use them and to interpret the data in meaningful ways. So beyond the actual things that are being reported, which I agree with Camila, we definitely need to update what is being reported in the reports. We also need to update the way that the reports and the information are made available and accessible to the public.
Yeah, and I think two things I think about in terms of Dylan's line there about how people actually access this information. I think it would be beneficial to, on the one hand, have all of this information in one place, right? And there are for current disclosures, there's usually some level of one-stop shopping in both the House and the Senate that you can go to find this information. And I think there are information gaps that Camila was talking about that we need to fill, especially if and as these proposals go forward. But certainly having it in one place is important, and having it be accessible to all users and sensible to sort of the lay person, rather than sort of buried behind pages and pages of search results and technical language. I think that's important. I also think it's important I think it would be an important step for each member of Congress to have access to or a link to this information on their individual websites. There are 535 members of Congress, 535 individual congressional websites out there. I think it would be helpful if, along with everything else that goes on a member of Congress's website, such as the contact information for their office, their press releases, that you have a tab or a page that leads to this disclosure information, because it's important that constituents know their own member of Congress is complying, and that constituents have access to this critical public information about how their members of Congress are complying with the law.
Thank you all very much. I see we've approached the 9:45 mark. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Camila, Dylan, and Andrew, for your thoughtful analysis. And thank you to Issue One for hosting. And Warren Rojas. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Warren.
Bye.
Thank you.